good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you here. If you are Towson University faculty, staff, or student, welcome. It's good to have you here. If you are a guest outside of Towson University, a special welcome to all of you. We are pleased to have Dr. Charissa Cheah here today, who will speak on Asian American families' experiences with racism and racial discrimination during the COVID-19 pandemic, and talk about serves University. Who is here, who raised this topic to my attention and wanted to act on the most recent march against American Pacific Islanders. And for those of you who may know or may not know, since the pandemic arrived in the US, there's been more than 60 hate incidents that have been reported. Has not stands today as one and one of hope. I'd like to introduce Dr. Xiaoming Liu. Dr. Liu is the Department of Education. Dr. Liu, turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Laurie. First of all, I just wanted to sincerely thank Dean Mullen for her support and sponsorship for this event. Your support means a lot, not just to the AAPI community, but to everybody at Towson. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Charissa Cheah. Dr. Cheah is a professor in the Department of Psychology and an affiliate faculty member in the Asian Studies Department at UMBC. She received her doctorate from University of Maryland and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at Yale University. As a cultural developmental scientist, Dr. Cheah utilizes mixed method approaches to explore how individual characteristics, relationships, socialization agents, and contexts interact to influence social, emotional, mental, and physical health. She's particularly interested in understanding all of these processes among Asian American and Muslim American families. Dr. Cheah is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and of the Association for Psychological Science. She's the past chair of the Society for Research in Child Development Asian Caucus and serves on the International Affairs Committee and the Rapid Assessment and the Response Strategy team of this organization. Dr. Cheah is an associate editor for the journal Child Development and sits on the editorial boards of Parenting, Science, and Practice and the International Journal of Behavior Development. She has published numerous journal articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries. Her research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and many other private foundations. Most recently, Dr. Cheah received a National Science Foundation Award to examine racial discrimination, parenting, identity development, and adjustment among Chinese American families during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're fortunate enough today to hear her findings from this project. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Charissa Cheah.
Thank you so much, Professor Liu and Dean Mullen for the kind introduction and invitation to be here. I am really grateful to be here, to be invited. I'm so honored and happy to speak with you this afternoon. appreciate being here, especially this month in May. So let me start sharing my screen. Okay. Can you see it? Can you all see it? Not yet. How about that? Okay, thank you. And as I was saying, I'm particularly honored to be here in the month of May, which is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which takes place in May to mark the arrival of the first Japanese immigrants to the United States and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. I'm going to start off this presentation with a rather somber poem that was written by Keith Yamashita, which I feel hits upon a few themes that we will be discussing today. So I'm going to read this to you. It reflects back on a particular moment in time for him, and it's titled "When I Realized My Friend Was White." I'm 5. He is 5. His name is Greg. He has an older brother, Mark. We are playing. He says, "You are a," and I can't play with you. Am I what? I ask. You are a dirty. I can't play with you. I didn't know what he meant, so I rebuffed him. I am not dirty. I just took a bath. No, you are a. My brother says you are a, and we can't play with you. What is a? I ask. Don't know, but you are one, Greg says. But I didn't know. I never heard that word before. I didn't know why I was one. Are you a? I asked Greg. I don't know. I need to go ask Mark. Mark comes back. He pulls his round eyes flat with his fingers like this, all slanty, and that is why we aren't going to play with you. I tried for the next week to open my eyes wide. I failed. My parents had to explain to me that Greg and Mark were white and that I was Chinese and Japanese. Years later, I found out that my parents moved me to this all-white neighborhood so we would fit into America, so that we would become Americans. So I chose this poem, which is one of many that actually have been written during this COVID-19 pandemic, as many people, many Asian Americans have reflected upon their experiences, not just during the year, but bringing up past experiences that have really been subdued in many ways and silenced. So this poem in particular, as a developmentalist, was of interest to me or spoke to me because it highlights how early some of these experiences start. It also highlights how much these ideas of racism are in the water, so to speak, so that even those who discriminate sometimes do not know why they do it, only that they are compelled to do so, to maintain some sort of hierarchy, some sort of norm that they're used to. This poem also to me highlights it doesn't matter what specific Asian heritage you're from. Racism isn't picky. Racism doesn't try to be accurate. And it also highlights how many immigrants desire to fit in, to be American, and the sacrifices that they make in order to try to achieve this goal. And some of these sacrifices inevitably undermine their own sense of belongingness, right? So in some cases, they're working against what it is that they're trying to do because they're playing into this broader system that we'll be discussing today as well. And at the same time, the poem notes who gets to be American, right? Hints at that. Who makes this decision? It's certainly not in the hands of the victimized. And so with that, we start off talking about the specific current circumstances this past year and a half. Every time I give a talk about the pandemic, it keeps getting longer. The timeline keeps going. But the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic on March 11, 2020. As the virus spread, so did misinformation and xenophobia, which is the excessive fear, dislike, and hostility toward anything foreign, anyone foreign, outside of one's own social group, nation, or country. Even before the virus reached American shores, News media reports of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia worldwide due to the COVID-19 pandemic were arising. Numerous editorials and commentaries were published in the top academic journals across medical and social behavioral sciences that warned about the rise in anti-Asian xenophobia and the possible consequences, not just for these communities, but for everyone as they distracted from sort of the true problems at hand and real solutions to addressing this pandemic. So in the United States, we start to see reports of anti-Asian racism in the media around February of 2020, where people started, noticing it. So to document this, a reporting center called Stop AAPI Hate was opened around March of 2020. There have been over 6,600 incident reports to Stop AAPI Hate just in 1 year, from March 2020 to March 2021 across the United States. Of course, it's important to remember that these are only the cases that have been reported. So if we take a little bit of a step back and sort of break down these hate incidences, we start to see some variations, some shared experiences, but then there's some subgroups that are particularly targeted that match on to some of the stereotypes and the xenophobic messages that have been passed along. The shootings at the 3 Atlanta spas, area spas, leaving 8 dead, including 6 women of Asian descent, really highlighted some of the issues of intersectionality as well, where women are over 2/3 of the victims. And what's interesting is also, and what's contributed to this idea of feeling of lack of safety, is that most of these incidences have occurred in public spaces, in businesses, on the sidewalk. But before we go on, I want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of racism and racial discrimination. And this is important because much of what we hear about, read about, and see on social media and in the media are really instances of or acts of discrimination. But it's really important that racism includes norms, ideologies, processes, and behaviors that are maintained by dominant groups, which create and sustain racial inequality. And so when we look at discrimination, actual acts of discrimination that deny certain groups access to resources, opportunities, and power, it's important to remember that these acts are not just through specific attitudes or actions. So they don't belong to specific people, even though, again, that's what we're most often confronted with, right? But they are really sustained through systems and structures. And again, it's important to remember this point and come back to it, especially when we start talking about solutions. Racism and racial discrimination in its various forms are determinants of poor physical, mental, and socioeconomic health, and we know this. So now going back to the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, the increase in xenophobia during any disease outbreak is not a new phenomenon. It's due to this process of what's called the racialization of disease, which is based on the belief that races are biologically distinct and therefore prone to specific diseases. Now, although genetics research rejects biological distinctions between racial categories, the linkages between these socially constructed categories of race or ethnicity to the cause and the effect of disease continues to happen even in biomedical research, in the way that people analyze data and the way that they present it. So again, it's important to be conscious of this. We've seen this again with past disease outbreaks, which led to the World Health Organization creating a set of guidelines in 2015 after the Ebola outbreak that really prohibited infectious diseases from being labeled So in their actual name, being based on a geographical location, on certain individuals or ethnic groups or cultures or populations, is because there are clear indications then when one does that, certain groups are targeted, and the consequences, as I mentioned before, are beyond just for individuals in that group. So for Asian Americans, it's really also important to understand and in order to be able to understand the experiences of contemporary Asians in the United States, one must also learn about the broader historical context. And so the image of Asian Americans in particular is a conflicting one. So on the one hand, there are yellow perils and perpetual foreigners, and we'll go into each of these in more depth later on, presenting threats to the physical and cultural health of the white dominant US society. On the other hand, I'm sure many here have heard of the model minority myth as well. So they're also characterized as being model minorities assumed to have overcome racial barriers and biases and having fulfilled the American dream by successfully integrating into mainstream society. So this conflict has actually contributed to the anti-Chinese sentiments in the United States. So early on, it was the yellow peril. The yellow peril, again, is this idea specifically that Chinese and other East Asian individuals are unclean in their diets and lifestyles and uncivilized. And such beliefs historically led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred Chinese workers and immigrants to the United States. Certainly, the motivation for this act was economic as well, right? Where white individuals felt threatened with regard to their jobs, their women, etc. And so some of these stereotypes were also created to facilitate the barring and to facilitate the marginalization and ill treatment of individuals of Asian descent. So I want to link this yellow peril idea, right? Unclean diets and lifestyle, and overlay that on a tweet from this pandemic. And if you see here, again, the same themes come up, right? Like unclean lifestyles, eating strange foods, being disease-ridden. So I'll give you another example. So this is the other stereotype of the perpetual foreigner, which is the idea that views Asian Americans as aliens, as foreign, as never American enough, regardless of their nativity, regardless of how many generations they've been here in the United States. Asian Americans are considered enemies within the United States and a foreign threat, always having this sort of double loyalty, right? And which most famously led to the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. But again, the same ideas are constantly with us. It's reflected in this tweet that I have here, where Chinese individuals are considered, there's a Chinese virus, but also the communist virus and a threat. And what is important to see here is that microaggressions such as, where were you born? Where are you from? Where are you really from? Oh, your English is really good, even after finding out that someone was born in the United States. Again, belies this assumption that Asian Americans are never American enough, right? You must come from somewhere. You must be foreign. So we see that these historical tropes are not just historical, as in that they're in the past, but they continue to have real relevance to the experiences of Asian Americans, and particularly during times of threat. Okay, so then the other idea is this model minority stereotype, which was created more recently during the civil rights movement, actually, as a way to maintain white superiority and used to deny the existence of structural inequality and systemic racism, and in particular used to suppress other racial minority groups, especially the Black community that was very much engaged in advocacy at that time, obviously during the civil rights movement. So the stereotype became a myth that really pit Asian Americans as against the Black community because they were starting to work together. And the stereotype, even though it sounds positive, is used to marginalize Asian Americans and to keep us out of the conversation, right? Especially political conversations and conversations that have to do with advocacy. So the goal of the stereotype is to preserve the status quo of who is on top while making those below fight for limited resources, and in doing so, forget about who really is controlling the resources. And again, this is an important point because as we come back to thinking about how to move forward, this idea can help guide us in our next moves. This myth also ignores large within group variations. And so I'm just going to spend the next few slides helping us get to know who Asian Americans are. So the term Asian Americans actually was created in 1968 as a political way to create and to bring together activists of Asian descent to have a stronger voice. And so although 6 origin groups make up about 85% of all Asian Americans, in actuality, they're out of the 23 Asian Americans who trace their roots, 23 Asian Americans trace their roots to more than 20 countries in East and Southeast Asia and in the Indian subcontinent, and each with unique histories, cultures, languages, and other characteristics. And it's really important to also know that within each of these Asian countries, that there are multiple, subgroups and sub-ethnic groups, many of them having their own languages as well. So the Asian Americans in the US speak over 100 different languages. The other statistics that is important to note is that this population grew by 81% between 2000 and 2019, and is projected to be the largest immigrant group by 2055. Some other things that may be less known, some other aspects of statistics, is that 14% of the 10.5 million unauthorized immigrants in the US comprise individuals from Asia. 71% of Asian American adults were foreign-born. 66% speak a language other than English at home. And while 95% of US-born Asians self-reported as being proficient in English, 57% of those who were foreign-born Asians did so as well. Overall, Asian Americans do well on measures of economic well-being, which contributes to this model minority stereotype. But as I hope that you're starting to see, that there are huge variations within the Asian American group. In fact, Asian Americans as a group have the highest income gap, which is the difference between the highest earners and the lowest earners. And so these numbers and variations, again, are really important when we talk about even coalition building, even efforts that need to be done within the Asian American community because of such huge diversity. So going to the present project, and hopefully that background will help situate the current studies and set of projects that I'll be talking about. We really wanted to document what was happening during this period at the start of the pandemic. And so our group, we have been working with Chinese and Korean American families in the Maryland area for over 15 years. And as we saw the waves of xenophobia rising, we felt that was really important, again, to sort of document this because this wasn't done effectively in previous racialization of disease events, such as SARS, most relevant to the Asian community. We also wanted to reveal protective factors. So really focusing on strengths as well, both short-term and long-term. So we assessed these families at 2 points in time. In collaboration with computer scientists and information scientists, we also collected large-scale data, so tweets, in order to really understand more of the broader public opinion during this period to situate these families' experiences. And we certainly wanted also to produce educational materials and focus more on outreach and dissemination of these findings as quickly as possible to be able to help address the needs of the families during the pandemic as much as possible, but also going forward in preparation and how to build on strengths. So moving on to this particular study, we focus on Chinese Americans because the first cases of the virus were identified in China, and based on news accounts, Chinese heritage individuals were the targets of most of these acts of racism and discrimination, and also anti-Chinese sentiments were high and remain high at the start of even before the pandemic hit. We focus on 6 types of racism and racial discrimination because we wanted to document, again, a wide variety of experiences from micro to macro versions of discrimination. So personal racial discrimination as well as collective racism, which is really racism at a group level, which may not involve personal experiences or even the witnessing or hearing about any specific incidents associated with any identified individuals. So this general perception that individuals of your race or ethnicity or culture were viewed negatively. So we looked at these experiences in person as well as online, and both direct and vicarious forms of discrimination in order to obtain 4 types of personal racial discrimination. So you can see the combination of in-person, online, direct, and vicarious. And with regard to collective racism, we looked at perceptions of xenophobia, health-related xenophobia in particular, which is the perception that Americans consider Chinese people, culture, and lifestyle to be a health threat to American society, and xenophobia in the media, which is the idea that the media perpetuated this fear, hatred, and hostility towards Chinese people, culture, or China as a country. So I'll first present the rates of these various forms of discrimination, and then associations with mental health. I will also present some of the newest data from our data set from Wave 2. So hot off the presses, you're the first ones to see what happened in Wave 2, what we found. And I'll end with the data portion by sharing some quotes from families who participated in our qualitative interviews. So just a general overview of the methodology. We had administered surveys online because we couldn't get to online was the only way we could get to the families at the start of the pandemic. We conducted interviews with a subgroup of these families. And then, as I had mentioned, we also collected tweet data, which we're still collecting now. So in Wave 1, we had about 500 parents of 4 to 8-year-olds, and 240 of the older children, 10 to 18-year-olds, also self-reported on their own experiences, their mental health, and their identity. 94 parents were selected to obtain an equal distribution across different ages and gender. And in Wave 2, which we just completed in April, we have 500 or so parents. It's important to note that we tried to get as many of these parents from Wave 1 to return so that we could have longitudinal data to look at change or stability over time. But of course, we knew that we would lose a lot of these families just because of the pandemic. So we also sampled new families as well to increase our sample size. And then we also focus particular attention on diet, so getting parent-child diets, and we're able to increase our sample to over 300 youth who also self-reported, on which we also have parent data on, so that we're able to look at within family processes. And all the 79 parents are returning parents from the original 94 in wave 1. So some general big, findings: 3 out of 4 Chinese American parents and adolescents, approximately, witness COVID-19 related racial discrimination online or in person. 1 in 4 parents and adolescents directly experience COVID-19 related racial discrimination at least once online or in person. So these are wave 1 data, which is last year, and here's more of a breakdown of these data. So I know that there's a lot going on here, so I'll just highlight some of the key points. First, we look at both parents and the child and the youth, right? So this is the subsample where, no, actually, sorry, this is the whole sample, but we broke it up into, the parents report and youth report. 31% of parents and 45% of youth reported being the victim of discrimination online. And in this graph, what you'll see is that out of the individuals who reported experiencing racism or discrimination, we broke it down to how frequently. So from almost every day to once or twice a month since the start of the pandemic. So then we look at in-person direct numbers, percentages, and when we look at online vicarious, so this is online witnessing someone else of your same race or ethnicity being targeted by discrimination, and then in-person vicarious, meaning that you are witnessing someone else in real life being the victim of discrimination or racism. Obviously, these numbers are really concerning, and people ask us, can this be true, right? Or can the numbers actually be this high, especially in terms of the frequency? And so we wanted to look at, wave 2 data as well to see if there was any sort of consistency, how it might compare. And so again, it's important to note that I'm not presenting these as, changes in time per se in the same families, right? Because I said that a subset were new families who were recruited. But so if we look at them right now, these data in snippets of time, and we'll conduct the analyses later on the subsample on which we have the same families at both times, we see an interesting pattern that's similar across adults and youth, which is that vicarious discrimination, so both online and in person, the observation of discrimination in seeing someone else being victimized was lower in wave 2 than in wave 1. But direct discrimination, again, both online and in person, was higher in wave 2 than in wave 1. And later on, I can talk about some ideas of why this might be. But again, I think that what's important to note is that these families are consistently still experiencing, right, as a whole, as a group, whether they're the same families or new families, Chinese American families are still experiencing, witnessing these acts of discrimination. So with regard to collective racism, again, this is the specifically here, xenophobia, right? The perception of how your race or ethnicity is viewed in your culture, in your lifestyle, your whole being by just mainstream American culture. And what we see is that health xenophobia, so being blamed for or being seen as a threat to the health of Americans, decrease from wave 1 to wave 2. So this is, we feel that it's likely a result of just more information and knowledge about the virus having come about, compared to a year ago, last March, right? March to April, last spring. So some of this misinformation has perhaps decreased, but what increased was this perception of the media as continuing to perpetuate ideas of xenophobia, right? Of fears and hatred of, again, Chinese individuals, culture, and lifestyle. So these numbers were higher at wave 2. So again, a lot of words here, but again, I knew this was being recorded and I wanted this here for individuals to be able to reflect back. And I'll just take you and read through at your leisure if you're interested. But really the take home message is that every form of discrimination and racism, so all 6 forms, were associated with poorer mental health in both adults and in youth, right? So parents' experiences of discrimination and racism were associated with their own poorer mental health. Direct experiences of discrimination, both online and in person, so that is, you are the victim, were also associated with poorer psychological well-being. So it was associated with higher depressive symptoms and anxiety, but also decrease your sense of psychological well-being, which is this general composite of self-esteem, sense of mastery over your environment, purpose in life, right? So we're seeing that direct experiences, not surprisingly, was particularly damaging. And xenophobia, collective racism. So regardless of whether you've experienced or even witnessed, just the sense that others view your group negatively were associated also with poor, indices of poorer mental health and psychological well-being. So these are, again, adults and youth. We're talking about 10 to 18-year-olds. Okay. And the other thing that was important to share and for us to note was that parents' experiences of discrimination and racism were associated with their children's self-reported mental health. So if parents were, experienced discrimination, especially, direct experiences, their children were more likely to self-report higher levels of anxiety and other internalizing problems. So what we're seeing here is that some kind of spillover effect, right? And I think this message is really important as parents think about how do I protect my child, right? And also to think about the family climate as well. Even if parents don't think that their children are receiving or witnessing, discrimination, their own experiences and how they're processing it are also impacting their child either in some direct or indirect way. And another thing that was interesting is that collective racism, parents' perception of collective racism, so xenophobia, was associated with more externalizing problems, which is not just internalizing problems. And we felt that in terms of interpreting these findings, that collective racism just feels a lot more out of the control of the individual. So when these youth perceived, beyond just specific acts by specific people, right? Either people they know or witness, or just this broader sense of social rejection from, the place that you call home, the country that you call home, that you identify with, is, more likely to be associated with the sense of externalizing, acting out. Again, in addition to the internalizing of negative affect. So then we were interested in, well, what about parenting, right? What were parents doing during this pandemic? And what we found, we focused on racial ethnic socialization in particular, which is the transmission of messages from parents to children regarding ethnicity, race, and culture. And so just very quickly, we took a profile-centered or person-centered approach. So we looked at how different practices or different dimensions of racial ethnic socialization went together. And we were interested in how these different profiles and groups that went together, groups of parents who engage in this similar rates of practices, and how these profiles were associated with children's outcomes, both academic and social emotional difficulties. And then we were interested in what were some demographic correlates of experiences of parents that were associated with the different types of parenting profiles. So just to give you, again, a quick sense of some examples of racial ethnic socialization, and we can talk more about these later, but some of the main ones that have been studied include the maintenance of heritage culture. So teaching your children about your cultural heritage, values, language. Some parents engage also in becoming American. Is this name of this dimension, which is really the socialization focused on integrating into the majority culture. Awareness of discrimination, conveying messages about prejudice and discrimination that they might encounter or they might face because of their race and ethnicity. And then there are others like avoidance of outgroup, minimization of race messages. So this is the colorblind approach, right? That, oh, we're all equal, and so race doesn't matter. People aren't really racist. Just maybe certain individuals, but we've moved beyond that, right? And cultural pluralism, conveying messages about the importance of diversity and different perspectives and how that's a strength. We also looked at 3 specific racial ethnic socialization during COVID, that through focus groups and listening to parents, we found that some Chinese American parents were engaging in these. So they talked about, this fear and, needing to teach their children maybe to downplay, to hide their connections to China or the Chinese culture. They prepared their children talked to them about how they might potentially be the victims of discrimination during the pandemic. And also avoiding other Asians. There were some parents who talked about teaching their children to avoid, either Asian people or businesses, again, to sort of, self-isolate as a protective mechanism, especially you can imagine during the height of the pandemic. So what we found was that there were 3 profiles that emerged from this, data set. And the first profile were parents who engage in high heritage and cultural pluralism only. So that was the main socialization strategies that they engaged in, just teaching about heritage culture and the importance of diversity. It's important to note that all parents across all groups actually did engage in high levels of heritage culture socialization. And that's probably because most of our sample were first generation Chinese American families, the majority. And so I think that maintaining their heritage culture and language and practices and identity was important to these families. So then the second most frequent profile that was found was what we call the multicultural profile. And these were, as I mentioned, parents who maintained their heritage culture, but at the same time, they promoted and prepared children for cross-ethnic racial interactions. So they talked about, becoming American, and they encourage interactions with others of other ethnic racial groups. And so there was low levels of avoidance of outgroups and low levels of minimization of race dimensions, that colorblind approach. And the last profile was what we call the high non-selective profile. And this profile was really interesting because parents on this profile were higher on a lot of, on all the dimensions. And so in trying to understand what this meant, it really seemed, as we'll see later on, that these families were reacting to the sudden high rates of discrimination that they were experiencing. And so they were engaging in different, all these different racial socialization practices without really, sort of distinguishing between them. And we found that this, just in the interest of time, in terms of moving on, outcomes, that the profile 3 was associated with the poorest academic and social emotional outcomes in children. And again, I can talk more about, in the Q&A, if anyone's interested, on what this profile might be, because it really informed our ideas also, and it fits in with, even though, previous literature has not looked at racial ethnic socialization during a stressful, particularly stressful, heightened period of discrimination among Asian Americans like this. It gave us some ideas for solutions, or at least suggestions for parents going forward about what types of strategies might be more versus less effective. So as I said, I'm going to present some qualitative data. And so these qualitative data that we've analyzed, the lead author being one of my co-PIs, Dr. Wang from University of Maryland, we focus on the younger group, so elementary school age children. And what we found, just some brief numbers, was that 45% of parents reported experiencing some form of COVID-19 racial bullying, that their children experienced this, right? And this was in elementary school, and this was, again, early on during like March to May. 73% expressed concerns about racial bullying and discrimination, but 70% of parents did not have any specific discussions about race or discrimination with their children. Again, this is early on, so I'm really curious to see how at the second wave, whether parents have started to, during this period, engage in more racial ethnic socialization, because as you'll see in some of the data, parents were indicating that they might need to start doing so. So just an example about, a concern. So this is a first generation Chinese immigrant mother of a 7-year-old boy. We are concerned, we're definitely concerned about our children. We worry about them. We remind them, since the newspaper, websites, they talk about somewhere, people for no reasons bully Chinese students. So as parents, we definitely remind them to be careful when going outside and to be alert, not going where too many people gather. Okay, so you can see the fear here, and you wonder what else they're telling their children as well, right? And we'll get to, won't be able to talk about that in this presentation, but happy to share more later. This is another example of, this is an example of many, so as I said, over 70% of parents reported not talking to their children about race. And this is an example of, a rationale underlying why parents might be not talking to their children. So this parent said that they're trying to avoid that conversation. Oh, my child's only 7, 7. And so this idea, that one theme that came up was that children were too young to really understand the complex ideas, and talking to them about race would make them fearful, make their children fearful, worried, to feel inferior or helpless, right? So she didn't want her child to be preoccupied with the potential of being discriminated against. And so here, I wanted to share this example. This is a second generation Chinese American father of a 9-year-old girl who, in reflecting on his child's experiences, in talking about his child's experiences, reflected about his own experiences, right? As an adult, not feeling a part of society, feeling excluded, feeling, missing promotions because of racial discrimination. This idea that this marginalization, this displacement in American society. And then the last example that I wanted to share was that this first generation Chinese immigrant mother of an 11-year-old boy talked about not having talked to her child about it, but this idea that she had to start doing it, that, she had no choice, that she had to engage in racial ethnic socialization. She talks about, Trump's use of the Chinese virus comments after the news of anti-Asian racial incidents. We felt we needed to prepare him based on these events. And she even talked about this idea of before, after, right? When there was no COVID-19 pandemic before, you would feel as if everything was fine, but now we encounter a more aggressive time and we feel we need to discuss it with him. And this I felt was really interesting, and understand his thoughts, because his ideas about race, or her child's ideas about race, are actually different from ours. And I think this really reflects a core of what a lot of, first generation immigrant parents are experiencing, right? This realizing that they did not grow up in this racialized America, and they did not have necessarily the words or experiences or understanding that was necessary to have these conversations with their children. But also realizing that their children, whether they like it or not, or whether they are prepared or not, are growing up in a racialized America. And so a lot of parents talked about just the need to, need to do it, but not knowing how to. So these are the data, and oh, sorry, one last thing. So for as an College of Education, I thought that you might be interested, that we also asked parents. So, my colleague and collaborator, Shishan Wang, is a school counseling psychologist. And so she was also really interested in what parents' ideas about what schools could do, what parents felt they needed from their schools. And here are the first four I want to talk about first. So taking a proactive approach. So they wanted schools to reach out, but to set up clear, established rules about discrimination and consequences, for bullying and discrimination. They wanted schools to promote a scientific understanding of COVID. So basically dismantling myths and stereotypes and misinformation, right, surrounding, again, this racialization of the pandemic. They wanted increased outreach to Asian American families. They wanted schools to check in with them, right, to see how they're doing. And they also wanted schools in general, right, so beyond the pandemic, to really promote and foster a school climate that really valued diversity. And some parents talked about integrating Asian American history, which I completely agree with, and perspectives into the school curriculum. And I wanted to spend a moment on this last point. A not insubstantial group of parents also talked about not wanting schools to do anything because they were concerned that overemphasizing the topics of race or discrimination during COVID-19 would just make their children, would just put a bull's eye on the backs of the children, as Congressman Meng said quite eloquently, right? That making trouble, speaking up will just put attention on you, and that attention could be very negative. And so I think this is really important to remember, because as we work with families and as we work with schools, and we might be coming from a point where we are pushing for more and more, awareness, but if we're not sensitive to the real fears that these families have, we're probably not going to get very far, right? So I'm going to finish off quickly with some recommendations, and I'll go through them quickly, but again, we can open it up and have a conversation about any of these. The Asian American Psychological Association, so I'm a little biased, has a nice actually shared document that's freely available, that has all kinds of resources, from mental health resources to advocacy resources to talking about your kids. I think it's really important to educate ourselves, our colleagues, our students, and others, stopping misinformation, right, about the historical and structural factors that has seeded racism and xenophobia. So again, going back to, my first few slides, right, where we start off, right, it's not history, it's, contemporary experiences of Asian Americans. And the interconnectedness of current anti-Asian racism with experiences of other marginalized communities is extremely important. Allyship, I'm going to come back to that point later. And then also educating families on the impact of racism and xenophobia on mental health and well-being. So I made recommendations, for instance, to pediatricians, when you are, especially early on during the pandemic, when you're talking to families about physical health, when you're checking in, and, you need to check in with racial minority families about their mental health as well. Okay, so the other thing that's important, self-care, radical healing, that means sharing your stories, that means, taking care of yourself, that means reaching out, strengthening your co-ethnic communities, seeking out community supports, and that's really important, especially for those of us who engage in, advocacy work, right? We often forget about ourselves, but we can't take care of others if we don't take care of ourselves. So we'll also come back to this point, because as you'll see, all this are really interconnected. So resist attempts to divide Asian and other Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. I think this is really important. Even I talked about the diversity of the Asian American community, right? There are lots of social, cultural, political, long-standing political, social, cultural, historical divides within the broader Asian American community that can easily be heightened and pull us apart. And this is the time that we need to resist these attempts to come together. And again, as I mentioned, work with other communities of color as well, because we're trying to address the same issue of systemic racism that keeps all of us down, not even people of color. There are wealth divides in there as well. Engaging in civic and political participation is really important. It gives us a sense of empowerment, a sense of taking back control. And so my next project that's going to be funded by the Russell Sage Foundation, building upon this National Science Foundation project, actually is going to look at civic engagement and participation and socialization in Asian American families. We're expanding it to include Korean American and Filipinx American families as well, to look at, again, like how parents can empower children, how children can empower parents, right, in these advocacy and civic engagement, values and practices. So for parents, engaging in racial ethnic socialization, preparing your children is really important, because they're going to need it. They're going to need that armor. And of course, to do it in a way that's developmentally appropriate, in a way that's supportive and nurturing, right? Not just in a way that raises fears, right? Like that makes them heighten, makes their fears heighten, but give them tools. And we can talk about more specific strategies later as well. And in actual, these strategies are for everyone, both for Asian Americans as well as for allies, right? Like all these strategies that I've talked about. Hollaback actually has these wonderful free programs that you can just sign up for, these workshops about how to be good bystanders. What do you do, and how to be how to intervene as a bystander in a safe way. So they talk about the 5 Ds: distract, delegate, delay, direct, and document. And they more recently partnered with Asian American Advancing Justice to adapt their bystander intervention training to focus specifically on the AAPI community. So I encourage all of you to have a look at that as well. And so I'm going to end there and thank everyone, to thank my collaborators, my wonderful graduate and undergraduate students, and of course, the funding agency who acted quickly to help us be able to. I've never started and ran a study this size so quickly. I think my lab, nobody slept and we're still going, but we appreciate the opportunity to be able to really, as I said, document and start to identify some of these processes that we felt obviously to be really important. And thank you all again for being here this time of the year.
So, Xiaoming, should we do?
We're going to do questions, right? Then, and there's also a second part, so don't leave. If you have questions, you can either put it in the chat. I'll be more than happy to read it out loud, or you can unmute and ask your questions.
We also had 3 questions, I think, that came in ahead of time. So we could maybe, start off with that if we think that might be a good way while people are maybe thinking about their ideas and questions. And I also love comments and feedback and also suggestions. We're continuing to do this work. So any insights that you have would be also really valuable and appreciated. So shall I start with the...
You want to answer those 3 questions first?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question that was posed were, what are some effective and practical strategies we can adopt or adapt to make a change to the current situation, meaning to reduce racism and racial discrimination against Asian Americans and basically everyone, right? So I wanted to thank the person who asked this question for ending it with the basically everyone, because I think that, as I hope that you've seen throughout this presentation, that it is a question and it is an issue that is relevant to basically everyone, right? And the way that we really change things is to address, to really tackle things at a systems and structure level and by working together. So I've talked a lot about specific acts of racism and discrimination here. A lot of the reports that you see, again, like in the media, there are these specific acts enacted or engaged in, perpetrated by a specific individual to another individual or a group of individuals. And it's really easy to get distracted with that, to get distracted by who that perpetrator was. And to deflect our attention and limited resources during this really stressful time. But we have to remember that for long-term changes, right, we need to, as I was saying, to address it at a systems and structures level. So what are policies, right? What are, policies that have to do anything with like economic policies that continue to marginalize people of color, that to keep them feeling as if they have such limited resources that they have to fight against each other, to keep them distracted from focusing, resources on white supremacy and dismantling those systems, right? Those are really the efforts, that we need to be making. So we see a lot of new efforts now, focusing on reporting, creating consequences, which, at the individual level, you can understand how individual people want some form of retribution. But at the same time, I really strongly advise, for those of us, especially, in academia, where we are able perhaps to make changes at a more systemic level, that's a lot of where we should be focusing our time and attention. So even our advocacy work, like you can target advocacy, at different levels. And so I would encourage you to think about how to change systems and policies and climate and expectations in that way. And coalition building around communities of color. There's a history of doing so, but really also admitting it, and really a lot of self-questioning, like how do we actually deal with white supremacy together across groups of color if we're not even dealing with power relations between ourselves. And so for the Asian American community, addressing anti-Blackness is a huge issue, a huge issue that needs to be focused on. And I know a lot of people are having that conversations, but these are the difficult conversations that we need to challenge ourselves with while we're building coalitions. So then the second, I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep talking, but the second, any questions about that, or should I move on to the next question? Okay, I'm seeing some nods, okay. The second question was about microaggressions against the AAPI community, along with people from other minority groups, and how we can support each other to minimize its negative impact. So microaggressions are defined as these like everyday, more subtle, sometimes subtle, oftentimes not so micro, intentional and sometimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias toward historically marginalized groups. So, some sort of typical examples that people talk about, and I mentioned this before with regard to the perpetual foreigner idea, where are you from, where are you really from, questioning your language, questioning your nationality, questioning why you're here, because you don't really belong here. These are, little microaggressions. They're called microaggressions because they at face value seem really subtle, but there's a whole body of research now that shows that microaggression cause racial trauma, right? And they do so, even if you maintain the ones that are micro level, even something like, okay, where are you from? Where are you really from? For some individuals, you could say, well, they might just be curious, right? Like they're just curious. They just want to get to know me better. And the issue with, I'm removing intent from this, right? I'm removing who that person who said this is and what their actual intent was, but I'm focusing on the consequence on that person, the person of color. When you get that question, you start to think about it. Why was this question asked? And as for some individuals who, maybe came more recently, that might be interpreted in a different way, right? So there's a lot of ambiguity with a question like that, but that constant questioning, right? What is the intention? Why do they want to know this? That constant questioning of, these across all these microaggressions, what did they mean? Why did they move away? Why did they look away? Why did they stop talking? you know, when I walked into the room, why did they change their seats? These all cause physiological, in addition to psychological stress. And there's all this evidence now that shows with, you know, African Americans that racial discrimination, microaggressions on a daily basis impact cardiovascular health, right? It's associated with shorter lifespans, is associated with, you know, trouble sleeping, and more recent research shows that to be true also for minority adolescents across our group, that they're just not sleeping, getting quality sleep when they're experiencing microaggressions and other forms of racial discrimination. So these are, you know, microaggressions are not micro is really the take-home message. What can we do? You know, Hollaback, that .org that I mentioned before, they have, again, a wonderful bystander training program that's good both for victims as well as for bystanders, right? So as a bystander, you know, a lot of the victims that I've met and I've spoken with talk about one of the most traumatic thing, besides just the act, right, of having someone say that to you or do that to you, the fact that nobody else said something, the fact that nobody else seemed to care or notice that that was wrong, was more traumatizing long-term, right, than just that one sentence or that one phrase that was said. And so I say that to appeal to everyone to really take the charge to inform yourself of how you can be a better ally and how you can be a better a bystander, and to intervene when you see these acts and not have it all fall on the victim to have to deal with the victimization in addition, right, to having to navigate that situation. I know we're over the 2 o'clock time. There's one more question. Should I go on or should I take one from?
Does anyone have any question? I haven't seen any in the chat, but I could have missed it.
I don't see anything either. I'm really terrible at. Barbara, did you have? Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you so much for all that you've shared. We are blessed in the College of Education at Towson of having many colleagues who represent Asian Pacific, Pacific Islander people. And I wondered whether any of my dear colleagues could tell us their own experiences related to your topic within the College of Education, or if not, at least within their families. It would help illuminate what you're talking about. Thank you very much.
Well, first, I think that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think that the next hour we're going to have a space to do that more in small groups. I think that I just feel that that might be more appropriate in that context where in a larger group like this, we don't know if people feel safe, which is part of, right? Like it's part of that power imbalance that no matter how well-meaning any, again, individual is, that there's no getting around the power imbalance that is just inherent in the way that, current, academia is currently. And we can talk about that as well, dismantling that as well. But, and so, I really appreciate your question, Barbara, but perhaps we could do that in the small spaces if people feel more comfortable. Does that? But again, I don't want to also, on the other hand, I don't want to speak for others. And if anyone wants to share, of course, go ahead.
Barbara, I just want to clarify a little bit. Did you mean during what happened, what we have experienced during pandemic, or any time?
Anytime,
Oh, anytime. Okay.
Anytime at all. I mean, you've been at Towson for a while, and perhaps there have been microaggressions, and some of us would like to know that. But also, particularly during this last year and a half, if there's been other things that have come up. Sure, whatever you think.
So I think we'll just do small group later. share the experience, right? And I can share an example, a quick example about what happened to my child when he was at school. It wasn't during the pandemic because, you know, he has been home all the time. It was before that when he was in first grade. He's now a sixth grader. At the cafeteria one day, he opened his lunchbox and I packed him noodles. And one of the other, his classmate at the same table said, "Ew, noodles." Just that. And he came home and told me that, and that's what the first time it happened. I just did some counseling on my side. I didn't, you know, report to the teacher. And a few days later, same thing, same person said the same thing again to him. And then I said, okay, I need to talk to the teacher about it. And I did. I'm glad I did. She was really, really supportive. And she said in the email, she said, things like that is not tolerant, period. So she talked to the other child and she asked him to apologize. So yeah, I'm really glad I reached out to the teacher.
Thanks for sharing.
So I don't see any hands. I just want to get through in case, you know, because I assume that the person who asked this last question is here in the audience. So I just want to make sure to address. And this is a question about parenting, actually, asking about, is there an appropriate age to start discussing topics such as racial discrimination with a child? When parents do, what tips do you have for parents? And I think that this is, you know, such an important question, because, you know, as I started off with that poem, you know, showing how early these experiences can start. And then, you know, with the qualitative data, we see that the struggle that parents have, you know, all parents want to protect their children, right? And the idea of talking to them about something so hurtful, to give, and the idea of giving them messages that they might be rejected, just because of who they are, of a characteristic that they can't change, is scary for parents, right? It undermines the whole kind of premise of being a parent, of protecting your child. But I would say that, you know, first, so my answer is as early as possible, because I want us to think about it as not a conversation about racial discrimination. So not about the discrimination piece only, but discussions about race, ethnicity, and culture. So when you think about it more broadly in this way, I think that you find that any age, you know, from birth, before birth, reading nursery rhymes, reading stories, right, to your growing fetus, is, you know, you can engage in racial ethnic socialization there, sharing with them their cultural heritage, you know, the stories about, you know, your ancestors, where you came from. These are all, you know, wonderful, beautiful things that you can do to build cultural pride, use stories, various media forms. All this socialization builds resilience, right, for the times where you will encounter discrimination, where you will be told that you're not good enough because of your membership in this group. Where parents hesitate is, and where the potential issue is, that when parents just stop there. So actually, as we saw in our sample, almost all parents, right, like, engage in these kind of cultural heritage practices. They seem to come more naturally, and they seem to be more, you know, seem to be more developmentally appropriate for parents. So they do this more naturally. But where they hesitate is this discussion about the discrimination piece that comes with talking about, so it's more the racial socialization rather than the ethnic cultural socialization piece of it. To talk about, and as I said, so kind of passing on messages about race relations, the racialization of the society, what it means for them, what it means for others, you know, where they stand, you know, their group relative and why. But I think it's important for parents to reflect on why they hesitate to do so. So even when, especially when they know that's important, right? Why do you still hesitate? And not to invalidate your hesitation or your fears or your concerns about doing so, but if you can identify where your hesitation is coming from, then you can best try to address it. So, you know, if you think that your child is too young to handle it, there are plenty of strategies and ways in which you can go about in a developmentally appropriate way. Think about the idea of fairness and sharing and equality. We have no hesitation talking to very, very young kids, right, about the importance of sharing. And diversity, equality, and talking about issues of race is as key and is founded in this idea of fairness, right, and equality, true equality. Unfortunately, we can't just talk about equality in a colorblind manner because our society is not equal. Our society is not colorblind. And so to raise children to pretend essentially that it is colorblind is hurting them, and it's certainly hurting other children of color as well. So, I say to you that children can handle this. And we are in a time and age where there are so many resources out there. So PBS has a whole set of resources for parents to talking about race, right? And yeah, for young children, Sesame Street is coming up with like all these resources. I have a colleague who's working with Sesame Street to further produce some of this material. And embracerace.org is another wonderful organization. They actually have, I'll put it in the chat later on, a webinar today actually about for educators. So talking about race with like young children, preschool age children, for educators. And so there are tons of resources out there. It's never too early to start. And if you think about it as issues of fairness and equality and striving to reach fairness and equality truly across all systems, then it makes us brave participants and to have brave conversations in it. And the other advice that I have for parents is that, especially for well-meaning parents, right? Like it feels so weighty. And it feels like this is such a huge task. What if I mess up? If I don't know it because, I didn't learn it. Many of us did not grow up being socialized, with these messages. And we're learning ourselves. But I think like with every other area of parenting where we don't get a manual that has everything in there that's all correct, it's the same thing, right? So just know that if you're trying your best, you're looking at resources, you're researching, and know that it's not just this one conversation that will make or break your child, right? In terms of their ideas about race and equality. It's many, many, many conversations over time. And if you get it wrong one time, if you say the wrong thing one time, if you mess up, there are opportunities to correct. Right? Same thing with sharing. A child doesn't just share like that. Right? Many messages, opportunities to fail and trial and error, parents finding the right ways to do it. I think that when I realized that, it took a weight off that, the task of having to talk to my child about these issues. It's okay if I make mistakes. I'm trying. And the important thing, again, is to have these conversations and to understand, again, why my hesitations come from and what I can do to feel better. So if it's not understanding, having a firm understanding of Asian American history or cross-race coalitions and how we can work together, then it's on me again, going back to the points of educating myself and, finding out more about it, looking for resources.
Rebecca had her hand up earlier.
Yeah. Hi. I was curious during the Trump presidency, I was baffled, amazed, and disgusted over and over again by his constant racial slurs, blaming Chinese people for COVID, attacking people from Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. And I'm wondering, now that there's a new administration, are there activists working on some kind of recourse for political leaders who are spewing this kind of hatred? Because Trump set us back, by empowering white supremacists. And it just seems like under the Republican administration, it may have been difficult to push back. But now that Biden is president, is there more of a climate? Are there advocacy groups working on this, legal groups, so that people who are running even for elected office are not allowed to scapegoat parts of the population?
I think that's the joys of living in a democracy, right? Like you get a lot of different views. I try not to get into politics in this I tried not to get into politics in this presentation because, you know, it's difficult to stop me, and it's really difficult to stop me talking to begin with about these issues once I get started. But I mean, certainly we saw that he in some ways opened the floodgate, and specifically, you know, for COVID, used these terminologies that targeted specific groups of people that then spread onto other groups of people who look like they might even maybe somewhat be associated with, you know, so he started off by saying it's the Chinese virus, the China virus, Wuhan virus, because also he was having trade wars with China, right? So it was a convenient way to scapegoat people and to distract people from, you know, his fumblings of some of the other policies and handling, without caring about the consequences, you know, for Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans. But I think that the thing that I try to remember is that it didn't start with Trump, right? Which is why I always go back to the historical pieces. And I don't want to be too distracted by Trump or his administration. While it's, again, like horrifying, I understand that it's in my face right now. You know, like, so Biden, when he came to office, one of the first memorandums that he signed was actually a bill that, a memorandum that condemned the use of, you know, terminology that, you know, racialize the disease, and that was across all, you know, different segments also in terms of what the CDC produces, you know, everything. And so there are definitely efforts, you know, in that direction. But again, like, I really think that it's important to remember that it's not just about one administration. And, you know, some might say it might be better that it's out in the obvious. I mean, it's not like these people weren't thinking these things before, but they were hiding it. So at least now we can, you know, we know very clearly, you know, who has certain views. And so perhaps there are other things and more effective things that we can work on instead of being, do you know what I mean? Like distracted also by some of the verbiage.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat, so I'll just read it out loud so people can hear it. It's from Barbara Creamer. She said, did anyone report that people of other minority groups were aggressive in establishing their head minority status at the expense of Asian Americans?
So in our study, we did not ask about the specific acts, and we didn't ask about like who, you know, the perpetrator was, so we don't have specific information. In you know, I think that in Stop AAPI Hate, they also do not collect that information. There is a recent database that did collect this information. It escapes me right now, and I can look it up later for those of you who are interested. And they, for the data, the sub data that they had, in which you know, the perpetrators, you know, race or ethnicity was reported, they shared that data with caveats that it's a limited subset, because many people don't report. So there's this narrative out there that there is, you know, and Black individuals are the majority, you know, perpetrators of anti-Asian violence. I want to say very clearly that these data that are out there, which are the only, empirical data that's out there, completely do not support that narrative. Okay, so the majority of anti-Asian violence during the COVID-19 in acts in which the perpetrators have been identified and some ethnicity, right? That's also always questionable because it's the reporter, it's what they could see, etc. The majority is perpetrated by a white individual or white passing individual. So I'm glad you brought that up, because again, that you know, there is this narrative, and as I said, like, I think it's the same narrative that feeds into you know, pitting minority groups against each other. So this is not to deny, again, you know, as I mentioned, that there are definitely issues and cross-race relations and struggles and conflict that needs to be worked out. But narratives such as that myth that, you know, like that we just busted, that we just busted, do not help. right? So let's focus on things that are actually there with regard to cross-ethnic relations, struggles and conflicts. So I appreciate the opportunity to respond to that. I hope that you had fruitful conversations. I know that in our group, we talked about a lot of different issues, and I really enjoyed the conversation. But I was hoping that if people felt comfortable within their groups in terms of what was shared, that they could share, a few of the key points to the larger group so that we can process them together. Who would like to go first?
I can share if that's.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Nicole.
One of the themes in the group that I was in was talking to our kids and how identifying that we're learning alongside them. Like, this is uncharted territory for us as parents, for us as a society, and so trying to learn as we move with our kids, trying to educate ourselves as we pass down that education to them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. So a place of vulnerability that, again, like this idea that, we're all at different stages. For some, for some groups, this has been a conversation that has needed to be had because lives are, at stake if you don't have the talk, right? There's no privilege, there's no, to not have to have the talk until something happens. For others, there is that privilege, but like stepping up, and actually doing it is really important. And someone in our group, Madeline, actually, I don't know, I really like your point if you wanted to share with the group, because I think it's really related to what we're talking about here.
The one about privilege.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so we were along the same lines. We talked about children and how they're kind of our next coming up generation. And I mentioned wanting to become a better ally, and that when I have children, they will be fully white, half white. So it was something that I didn't experience growing up, as I was never talked to about my privilege, like other children's that are Black, African American, Asian American, how they're kind of taught and have conversations about racism. I never had a conversation about privilege. And I feel like that was something that I kind of want to pass along to my children, that I think it's really important to talk to them about having what kind of privilege they have and how to use that privilege in a positive way, and to advocate for their friends that are around them. Kind of sum it all up.
That was actually exactly what we were talking about. And Maddie actually knows my two, and my children present differently. Like, my daughter presents very white and my son presents very Indian, South Asian. So having a conversation with basically my daughter, because my son wasn't having any of it, about how she's going to be treated differently, even though they have the same parents and the same upbringing and the same household, they eat the same food, it's all the same. People are going to look from the outside. And then another a member of our group, Laverne, was talking about how, and an experience that I've had with my kids as well, when you come from those mixed race, multicultural households, how sometimes, like, some of the microaggressions you'll get is when people don't identify you as the parent or as the relation of the children that you're with.
Right.
And they, Laverne was saying people would think she was the nanny when she was with her nieces and nephews. And I've had people outright ask me, like, are those both your kids? And I'm like, yes, they are. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Yes, I've heard that a lot. I also have a biracial child, and sort of navigating the two aspects of identities. But yeah, it just gives us a lot more to talk about, a lot more, strengths for him to draw from. He loves both aspects of his identity. When he's in, he can code switch really well and loves doing it. He gets pride from it. So hopefully he just turned 9 this Saturday. So hopefully, talk about learning, right? Like we're all, learning about this, and there are, certainly, as I said, like resources, people who are wise who we can draw from. Any other points? Perhaps like, does anyone want to share something from their group also about what they felt they needed next going forward?
Our group discussed how we see there's a lot of talk about discrimination against African Americans, but you don't really see there's not as much against discussion when it comes to Asian American and Pacific Islanders. It's almost like when we watch commercials, we see a lot of when you see biracial couples, it's always white and black. It's never you don't really get to see a whole lot of anything in between.
Yeah, I think this is a difficult issue, and again, like, I sort of hinted at it before that this is something, it's not a new issue. People have talked about it. There's a newer term that's being used called also the racial triangulation, this piece of where do Asian Americans fit in the black-white racial discussion that is usually, centered in the US for, many important reasons. And, some people talk about with the recent, rise in hate crimes that Asian Americans are, speaking up more and being more visible. And while this is a very simplified narrative, right, a simplified description of what is going on, I think it is a moment, for us to consider that many Asian Americans do feel left out of the conversations about race. And it's really problematic because it undermines the overall cause, right? So if we think that the overall cause, and I hope that we agree, is the true, as I said, sort of equality for all, where we can then not having, Asian Americans in the conversation is a disservice, because then they start having side conversations, right? And side narratives that that counter sometimes also the coalition building that's going on. And so I do see more and more efforts to include that. To be honest, like, I feel that as well, even in discussions in my, the department at UMBC, where we do a lot of race, anti-racist work in our department. I feel left out of the conversation, or, Asian American feel left out of the conversation. But the way that, I also see is that I recognize, full well that our struggles are very much that, unless we can really address the issues that, anti-Blackness issues and the issues and the struggles of the Black community, our whole society, we're not going anywhere. Nothing's going to improve. And so I personally, and I think that we all have to find where we all fit in this, right? So I myself personally find my role as supporting my, Black and brown colleagues in the quest. And I, learn a lot. I do what I can to use my white adjacentness in order to help support, their struggles, because I see that our fates are intertwined. And that's not the same as denying the pain that my Asian American community, feels. Right? To me, that one doesn't undermine the other. And for a while, I did struggle with that. I did say, well, if I bring attention to, struggles of Asian American, community, does that mean that I'm downplaying or I'm taking away? And then I realized, and there was a lot of guilt with that, right? It's a guilt, and then there's resentment. Why can't I share my pain? And then there's guilt. Oh, why am I thinking this way? Like, I'm not being a good ally, and back and forth. And then I realized that this is the game that they're making us play, right? Like, I started off by saying that this is the game that they're making us play, where we feel as if it is either me or you. And that's just not true. And so I like to think about it as what can we do? And that includes white allies in the we.
I think what you just said really resonates with me very, very well. I totally agree with you. We is everyone. Yes, I asked the first question. You addressed, and that is why I'm hoping we can. And thank you for sharing all those useful informations. And I think it's very, very important for all of us to be equipped with all kinds of skills and knowledge so that we as a collective whole, not just Asian American or Black or white or anyone, but be able to unify as a whole to fight for the discrimination. So yeah, appreciate that.
Thank you. Are there any final thoughts or questions or points? If not, I would just like to say that, again, I'm so grateful that you're here to have the conversation, to listen and learn and to share. And I hope that you will take some parts of it, like even the ideas about what you think you need, and share it with someone, and try to build on that, and to create the kind of environment and climate that you want here, at Towson, in your homes, in your communities. And, we always go back to, when I was thinking about strategies, what we can do, I, kept coming back to like Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model and all the intersecting levels and systems. I can't help it, developmentalists, but, and how we can make small movements in different ways that can have big impact. And so I hope that this, for some of you, started the conversation. For some of you, hopefully it, gave some fuel to continue going and continue doing the good work. But it's also a marathon. So I want to end off on self-care, and making sure that, you take care of yourself before you can take care of others, or in conjunction with taking care of others. And again, thank you so much for being here. And if I can, be a resource to you going forward, shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to help or to continue a conversation in any way.
Well, Dr. Cheah, on behalf of the College of Education, faculty, staff, students, and the whole community at Towson, I want to again thank you. It's been lovely. Your data is compelling. Troubling, but compelling. And we're happy to have heard from you today. I thought the best way to wrap up our time together would be to, if you'll allow me just to quote a couple of paragraphs from The Hill We Climb, which, as many of you know, was written by the poet laureate Amanda Gorman at President Biden's inauguration. So this starts on page 24. It's just very, very short, but I think it sums us up nicely. And she writes, "We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be. A country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens, but one thing is certain. If we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright." So again, thank you to everybody here today, and let's keep learning, and let's keep doing good work for ourselves and for our children. Dr. Cheah, Dr. Liu, thank you for today's session. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.